Michael Heath, who's a writer, and Tim White, producer, came to me. I was in New Zealand at the time, and asked me if I'd be interested in doing this slash horror film, B-grade sort of black comedy called Before the Night Is Out, as I recall, about a group of caterers that go around the country poisoning people in old folk homes. And I was sort of intrigued, and then the more I got into it, the more I wanted to steer it towards some more serious filmmaking, more of a psychological thriller, I suppose, and with a European flavour and style to it. And I was in the process of moving to Australia at the time anyway, in 1980, and Rob Lettet came to us and said that he could finance it through the 10BA system that was happening in Australia at the time. So we began working on the script and changing it more towards a sort of psychological thriller. And I was interested in less the gore and blood and more what you didn't see and what you didn't know that was going on, and more into fear, I guess, an atmospheric film. But unfortunately, with the 10BA system, they had a deadline that you had to have made your film by. And so we started on the first draft of the script, and we kept getting these messages, hurry up and start shooting. We said, well, we've only done, 2 drafts of the script, and we want to go a lot further. And eventually, because there had to be an end date that the film had to be completed by to fit within the tax year, we were just told to start shooting. So for me, I guess it was a bit disappointing that the script wasn't as developed as far as we'd like it to have gone. I wanted to move it out of the genre of B-grade slash horror film and more into the psychological thriller. And that gave you a lot more scope with atmospheric filmmaking, if you like. I started to work with the DOP, the late and great Gary Hansen, on the look of the film. We looked at a lot of Bertolucci. We looked at Last Tango in Paris, strangely enough, for the lighting and the camera moves and the colours within the frame. And so we wanted this film to have a certain style, even though in fact it was a horror film. We spent a lot of time building rigs, like overhead dollies that could track across the top of a set with the camera looking vertically down. And we got a Steadicam operator, Toby Phillips, involved. Now, in those days, Steadicam was fairly new to Australia. We were terrified of it because it used to take hours and hours to get it set up. Toby had just done a course with Gareth Brown, who invented Steadicam. Came back from the States, and I said, look, Toby, I'm really scared of Steadicam because I know how long it takes to set up, and you've got all these wires going everywhere. And Toby had brought back a little transmitter with him. He said, we'll transmit the picture, and so there are no wires involved. And he said, look, I'll come to work every day, I'll set up the Steadicam, it'll be there ready to go, and any time you want a Steadicam shot, it'll be there, it'll be set up faster than the grips can grab the tracks out of the van. So he taught me that Steadicam can be used as a dolly rather than as purely Steadicam. And we started to use it. If we wanted to do just a little push into an actor, we would grab Toby in the Steadicam and he'd do a little move for us that traditionally we would have laid tracks and put a dolly down for. So there were a lot of shots in the film that are Steadicam, you wouldn't know it. The thing about Next of Kin was to end up with this visual style that we wanted to achieve. The only way to do that was to storyboard the film and to plan every shot well in advance. And I did a deal with the first assistant director, who was responsible back to the backers and the producers of the film to bring it in on time and not go into overtime. We had a secret signal between us as to what was negotiable and what was non-negotiable. And when we'd come to a shot that was going to be a major effect shot or rig shot, he'd say, is this going to be non-negotiable? And I said, yes. He said, well, we're going to go into overtime. What do you want to get rid of? And I'd go through the script and I'd find a scene. I said, this one, we'd rip it out. We'd say, that's a non-negotiable shot and that is negotiable. So we had to plan the whole shoot very, very carefully and storyboard each shot to be able to get what we wanted to get. So there's one shot that there's one shot actually that tracks right down a corridor and into a close-up of the eye of an actor looking out through the door. And the only way we could execute the shot with all the problems of focus and all the rest was to start on the eye and then to shoot the shot in reverse, which meant all the actors had to walk backwards, and then we reversed your shot. These were visual ideas that really came out of the rewriting of the script into the psychological thriller. And so for the nightmare scene where she sees the body floating in the window, we shot the actor underwater in a swimming pool in Melbourne, and then it was matted into the window frame itself. For the scene where the body was in the bath, we shot it vertically. I mean, the great thing in shooting this in the studio was that we had no ceiling, so that we could track the camera into a lot of vertical shots. And shooting ultra high speed, it gave it a very surreal kind of a feel. In fact, the actual scene, if you see it at normal speed, only happened in a few seconds, but the slow motion just gave it this sort of surreal movement. We built a set out for the whole interior of the house, and along the top of the various rooms, we laid rails, and so that the camera could be supported from above on tracking devices that were where the rails were on top of the set. And so we were shooting at about 120 frames with 5 people on 2 ropes on either side of the dolly, running as fast as they possibly could to keep up with the actor. So yeah, it worked out pretty well. Last shot in the film, I wanted it to be one of these Hitchcockian one-shot takes, one take, one shot. And the idea was that the camera would crane from a high angle as the girl came out of the roadside diner. And as she gets into the back of the truck, the camera tracks into the back of the truck until we're looking at her through the back window. The car takes off, and the camera is now on the car. We pan back, and as we pan back to see where we've just been, the whole building blows up. We had this fantastic grip, Noel MacDonald, who was an engineer by trade, and he built this amazing crane to do the end shot of the film. We basically wanted to start in a high shot of the diner as the girl comes out, and then crane down, and then as she gets into the car, we would track into the back of the ute until we're looking at her through the back window. And then this whole pod, which was the end of the crane, would slide forward off the crane and be screwed in by 4 assistant grips quickly into the holes that were prepared in the back of the ute. Noel had to send to Japan to get little servo motors so that the weights, as the weight changes from one end of the crane to the other, all the weights in the crane would slide back as counterweights to the other end of the crane. We found that when we put the pod in the back of the ute, the whole ute would sink quite visibly in frame with the weight going on. So we had to, Noel built these hydraulic jacks on each corner of the car that would hold the weight of the car. Then as the car was about to start out, we'd release the hydraulics so the car went down as it moved forward. So it took us a week to rehearse the shot and a day to set it up on the actual day of the shoot. The sad thing about the shot, or the fun, or the amusing thing, I suppose, is that the camera had to track from looking at the back of the through the window, the back of the ute. We had to pan around until we were looking at the building, and at that point the building was supposed to explode. But something went wrong with the transmitter that was transmitting the video split back to our special effects guy hiding in the trees in a caravan with his hand on the plunger, and suddenly his picture went black, and he had to guess when we were doing the pan, and he sort of crossed himself and took a guess and hit the button, and of course we hadn't panned yet. So as the explosion happened, the cameraman realised it had gone off, and he did his pan. And we'd built this roadside sign that said fire danger today with an arrow, and that was our motivation to do the pan. And then we saw the second explosion reflected on that sign, and by the time we got back to the building, most of the explosion had happened, and we just saw the last one go up. And after we finally called cut, the grip, Noel, who had spent months and months building this crane, just broke down in tears. And the special effect guy who pushed the button too soon was white and just about fainted, and the guy who had erected the transmitted picture, the video split transmission, was ready to resign. And there were a lot of throats just about ready to be cut. But then the public saw it and said, we loved that end shot, the motivation of having the explosion in the window and the explosion on the sign, and then not seeing the explosion till the end was just such restraint. It was brilliant. one of the difficulties with that whole end scene was that because it was supposed to happen at sunrise, and we knew that it would take a full day to set the crane up and rehearse the shot, we had to find a road that faced west because we were going to use day for night, as it were, or dusk for dawn. And then we had to find a road that not only faced west but had this clear space at one end where we could build the diner. So we built the diner on set, and it was an exterior set, and the whole front of it, of course, had to had to be a breakaway so that the van could smash into the front of the diner with breakaway glass, breakaway balsa wood pillars and so forth, and a lot of sparks and special effects set up at the same time. So it was quite an ask for an art department and a location finder to find the perfect spot for this whole scene to take place. I remember during the shooting of the film, we were actually starting on the film, and what was supposed to happen to that scene was the van is just supposed to smash into the glass and give everyone a bit of a fright. And I thought, well, it'd be nice to build up the tension somehow before it comes, to have a sort of a lull where it's all been hell for leather up to this point, and for everything to stop. And I was watching television one night thinking about this, and on came some ballroom dancing. I thought, oh, maybe on the television we slow everything down with this waltz, again probably influenced by Last Tango in Paris. So we thought we'd decided to have the scene on television of these people going into this very strange sort of slowed down tango, and the next day I was sitting in a restaurant, and I was thinking about this tango idea. And as I was sitting there having a coffee, there was a little bowl of sugar cubes, and I started to play with these sugar cubes. And I started to build this wall of sugar cubes. And I thought, that'd be a great idea. Maybe there's the Last Tango in Paris, or this tango ballroom competition is playing on television. That's just my little homage to Bertolucci. And the kid starts to build this brick wall made of sugar cubes. We came to the day of the shoot, and the art department said, look, we don't know how to make this brick wall. It won't stay up. And they'd been trying to make models, and they had plastic replicas of sugar that didn't look real, and they had cardboard cutout sugar. Well, it just wasn't happening. And every time they tried to build the wall, it would fall down. And so first assistant was saying, we've got to get this shot, Tony. We're going into overtime. We've got to get this shot. We've got an hour to go. So I said, well, I did it. And they said, well, then you're going to have to do it. So the standby props guy moved out. I sat down. I thought, it's either now or never. And I built this wall. I got it right up, and I got it to the last one, put it on, it held, jumped out, and said, turn over. And we shot it. I knew that if I didn't do it, it wasn't going to happen. Well, it's interesting that Tarantino said the film reminded him of The Shining, because I hadn't seen The Shining at that stage. But what's significant was that I did want the film to have a European feel, and that I had been showing the DOP, Gary Hansen, Last Tango in Paris, and films of Bertolucci, The Conformist, and we looked at the lighting. We to get the camera low enough to the ground to be able to track, we had a prism made so that the lens could be within centimetres of the floor so that we could track it. And that was very much, I guess, the European influence. So it's interesting that, that he said it looked like The Shining, because that was certainly, it was that style of filmmaking that was influencing us. Fred Skepsey was in his Hollywood days. He wasn't around when we made the film. In fact, Fred had left Film House under the management of Robert Lettet and had virtually said to close it down. Robert had managed to keep the film going. He asked me to come, leave New Zealand and come to Melbourne to join Film House, virtually to replace Fred, who by this time was in Hollywood. He, after Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, he had made the move to America, and he was ensconced in making movies in America, so he wasn't around when we made Next of Kin. In working with 10BA, no one seemed to give a damn about the film itself. No one really cared about the script. They just wanted us to complete shooting, editing, and release the print before the end of the tax year, so that all the investors would get their tax breaks. That was principle. And that seemed to be the driving force behind the whole movement. So in the one sense, that year, it was great that there were 40 films made in Australia, But of course, one of the problems in Australia is that we all speak English. If we spoke French in Australia, all 40 films would have been screened. But there's no way 40 Australian films are going to compete with 40 American films, so most of them never got screened, including Next of Kin. I think because the film was made under this 10BA blanket, it didn't have the loving, hands-on care from the group of filmmakers, producers that another film might have had. In other words, once we finished it, we edited it, and it was completed, it just disappeared. It went off to a few festivals, which I didn't even know it was going to these festivals. It went to Stygius, and it won Best Director, and it Max Lemmon won Best Editing at the AFI Awards, but it just sort of vanished from sight, and we all sort of lost contact with it. It wasn't until, I suppose, 20 years later, it's suddenly become a bit of a cult film in America, and Tarantino discovered it and has been raving about it. So it now has this sort of little cult following after all these years. And it's only just come out on DVD as well. So yeah, it was sad. It would be nice to have seen it on a screen. It would be nice to have seen what would have happened after that, and maybe I would have gone on to make movies, I don't know, but it all just sort of died in the arse, and I think the 10BA system was probably responsible for that. There was a wonderful atmosphere when the Australian film industry got its kickstart in those early days, Picnic at Hanging Rock, and some of those early films that were being made with wonderful spirit, and they were Australian stories, they were Australian films. And in theory, 10BA should have built on that, and it should have expanded that sort of filmmaking, but it didn't seem to work. And I can only talk in our particular case, and I think the film suffered by the fact that it had to be made within a certain time frame. So we were being forced to shoot a script that was, barely past draft one, and forced to finish it by a certain day. We were struggling to get crew at times because there were so many people involved in so much production that it wasn't actually raising the quality of filmmaking. It was just raising the quantity of filmmaking. And I don't think it did, in the long run, it did the industry any good. Horror films haven't really been my genre at all. That's not the sort of area I would wanted to have gone into. It was by accident that these friends of mine came to me, Tim and Michael, asked me to do this film, and I thought, well, maybe this will get me going in the in movies, because I'd been doing lots of documentaries up until this time. But I'd spent some time in Paris during the height of the New Wave period, and I worked on, or at least I sat in on a production by Alain Resnais. And what I loved about the filmmaking in France at that time, in the 60s, was that they weren't huge ideas. They were little character-built ideas, story ideas, in which the director and the writer were probably the most important people in the whole process, and the actors were part of the ensemble. And they'd go out into the streets. The extras were the people who just happened to be walking by in Paris at the time. They shot in cafes and using available light, and they did lots of films. People like Eric Romer, Truffaut would just turn over film after film after film after film, and some of them would be terrible, some of them would be great, but everyone would be hanging out to see the next film from these directors. And I always wanted to see that sort of thing happen in Australia or New Zealand, and I guess it just never did, and nowadays it's sort of like, well, what American actor are you going to get to be in your film? And it's so hard to get. It takes years and years and years to get a film up now in this part of the world. And for a lot of people, if they get to make 2 or 3 films in a lifetime, they've done well. 1 or 2 crack it, and they end up going to Hollywood, becoming an American filmmaker, if you like, and do really well. But I guess I mourn the loss of the dedicated Australian filmmaker just making films in Australia one after another, as they used to in France in those days. I guess I just feel disappointed generally with much of the film industry in this part of the world, that so many Australian films don't get a release because they're competing with Hollywood. And I think, if we spoke a different language in Australia, all our films would be seen. But because we speak English, we have to compete with a big American picture. And, even to try and get films up nowadays is just so hard. An Australian film producer today, on a small independent production, will have a fee, having worked maybe 4 years on the film, will have a smaller fee than the American actor's agent will get for a few hours on a phone. It's really tough for Australian filmmakers. After making Next of Kin, I set up Sydney Film Company. We set up Marmalade Films initially with Fred Skepsey and Rob Lettet. And I'd only just set the company up, and I was approached to do Crocodile Dundee. And I had to turn it down because I'd just taken on staff, and I was too tied up with getting this film up and going. And then just keeping the film company rolling along really took a lot of my time. So I ended up, I guess, making my name in commercials, and didn't have another crack at a feature.
Next of Kin was the first horror film I was ever involved in, and it was with the late great Gary Hansen, who was the best cinematographer ever breathed, and it was an amazing little film to make, to be involved in blood and guts, and I was killed in a wheelchair, and the thing I remember about Next of Kin more than anything is the final shot, which started on a crane and it came down onto this garage, and then they tongued the camera off the crane onto a ute, bolted it underneath, and then they drove away, and this is all one shot. The garage blew up, and they spun the camera around to see the horrific mad woman at the end, all one shot. And they rehearsed it for a day. They tried to shoot it the next day, and they buggered up the tongue and into the ute, and the big butch grip cried. And they did it again the next day, but they stopped, thankfully, just before they blew up the garage. That's what I remember most about it, believe it or not, because it was just an amazing feat for those times. The gothic feeling of it, the classic gothic, feeling that from those old Dracula films, although it was in colour, it had that kind of film noir kind of shadowy thing about it, and it was in a mansion. So all those classic things, and the cliches were really well used. The bloated old man drowned in the bath, and all those visuals, I think, just come from that. I think they were inspired by the classic era of horror film making. He did things like when she was really upset, Gary Hansen, the DOP, she was really upset outside the hall, and he lit it so that it was like the light came from the crack in through from the hall and crack in the two doors, and he said to me to keep bouncing her in and around and about that light, so we came in and out of it, and to be aware of the camera. And being a lens louse that I am, he asked the right person, and through the argument, I technically threw her in and out of the light and myself in and out of the light, and played on what he'd set up, And he was a very clever man, and he died shortly after that in a helicopter crash. Yeah, very sad. It wasn't for the American market. It was specifically made for the European market, who at that time really went for those kind of films and did very well in Europe, and. So it did well out of for what it set out to do. I don't know of anyone who's seen Next of Kin in Australia, but apparently if I went to France or somewhere, there'd be a lot of people who'd say they'd seen it. What we're shocking at, and what we're still shocking at, is selling films. We make Maseratis and we leave them in the garage. We don't put them on the showroom very well, and a lot of those films died in the marketplace because no one knew how to sell them. I think that was the biggest disaster of those times. Tony Williams is a Kiwi. That's not his fault. And he came from advertising, and he got this little horror film up, which is his baby. And I think he went back to advertising. And I think he just stayed there. So he's a very sensible human being, especially for a Kiwi. I should have done that.